It began with a news report, just one of the endless stream of tragic events broadcasted daily. I had been tinkering in my lab at the Avengers compound, focused on perfecting an upgrade for my armor, when a flicker of movement on the television caught my attention. A local Ohio station displayed a grim headline: "Young people vanishing in small town, parents terrified." I wouldn't normally pay much attention to such stories. They're often tragic but mundane. But as the reporter's voice filled the room, my interest peaked. Parents of the missing teens described the same chilling detail. Each child had complained of identical nightmares before disappearing. They'd all been haunted by a man with a grotesquely burned face, wearing a tattered red sweater and long, gleaming claws where his fingers should be. The images shown of the grieving families were unnervingly vivid. At first, I dismissed it. Nightmares, mass hysteria, some bizarre coincidence. There had to be a rational explanation. But as the report continued, something gnawed at me. Dreams shouldn't leave you missing in the waking world, and if they did, it was my duty to find out why. The oddity of it all hinted at something otherworldly, perhaps extraterrestrial. That night, I reached out to Rhodey. "War Machine, I've got a strange one for you," I said, briefing him on the situation. I asked him to investigate the town while I stayed behind to finish my upgrades. He agreed without hesitation, and within hours, he was on the scene. At least, that's how it started. 3 days passed, and I hadn't heard a word from Rhodey. At first, I assumed he'd wrapped up the investigation and moved on to other duties without checking in. But as days stretched into nearly a week, unease settled over me. I tried reaching him repeatedly, but my calls went unanswered. This wasn't like Rhodey. Something was wrong. I suited up that night. The armor hummed to life around me as I rocketed into the Ohio sky. The town below appeared unremarkable at first glance. Small, quiet, shrouded in mist that clung to the streets like a second skin. Landing just outside the local diner, I approached cautiously, my sensor scanning for any anomalies. I stepped inside, startling the handful of patrons gathered around steaming cups of coffee. "Excuse me," I began, my voice even but firm. "I'm looking for a friend of mine, War Machine. He was here a few days ago investigating the disappearances." The room fell silent. Eyes darted nervously, spoons paused mid-stir. A heavy-set man at the counter finally broke the silence. "Yeah, we saw him," he said reluctantly. "He talked to some folks, went down to that burned-out factory on the edge of town. Haven't seen him since." The factory. My gut tightened. I visited the families of the missing teens next, starting with Margaret and Oliver, whose son had vanished a week earlier. The couple welcomed me into their modest home, their faces etched with grief. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured tea. "He was a good boy," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Always polite, always kind." But then, her words trailed off as tears welled up. Oliver picked up where she left off. "It started with nightmares," he said, gripping the armrest of his chair tightly. "He'd wake up screaming, said there was a man in his dreams. Said he had claws, burn marks all over his face. He was chasing him, trying to kill him." Margaret added, "The nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night, the same man, the same terror. He said it started in a nursery. He'd hear screaming. Then one day," her voice broke entirely, "he was just gone." The pattern repeated with every family I spoke to. Identical nightmares, the burned man with claws, and then disappearance. Every parent's face told the same story. Fear, confusion, and helplessness. Each dream began in the same place, a nursery. As I walked through the misty streets, piecing together the fragments of this mystery, an old man's voice stopped me in my tracks. "Leave this place," he called out. His voice was raspy, filled with an urgency that sent a shiver down my spine. He was seated on a rickety chair outside a decaying house, his face lined with age and fear. I approached cautiously. "What do you know about what's happening here?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for me to follow him. We walked together, his limbs slowing our pace, until we reached the edge of town. There, looming in the darkness, stood a derelict factory, its windows shattered, its walls blackened by fire. "It started here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. From his pocket, he pulled a folded piece of yellowed newspaper and handed it to me. The headline read, "Local Men Lynched by Angry Parents." The article detailed how a man named Freddy Krueger had been hunted down by a mob of grieving parents and burned alive in the factory's boiler room. The old man's hand trembled as he spoke. "He's not dead," he said. "Not really. He's in their dreams now. That's how he gets them. That's how he—" His voice broke, and he looked away, haunted. My chest tightened. "How do you know this?" I demanded. He met my gaze, his eyes hollow. "Because I saw him too, a long time ago, and I barely escaped." I stood there, the weight of his words sinking in. Freddy Krueger, a name that shouldn't mean anything to me, was now the center of this horrifying puzzle. As I flew back to my rented house in the town to regroup, my mind raced. This wasn't a rogue alien, a malfunctioning AI, or anything I could simply outhink or outfight. It was something far worse, something that defied the rules of reality itself. And as I prepared to dive deeper into this nightmare, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just scratched the surface of a darkness I wasn't sure I could face. It was well past midnight when I returned to the rented house. The old man's words were playing in my mind like a broken record. "He's not dead," he'd said, the fear in his voice so palpable it left a chill in the air. "He's in their dreams." How could something like that happen? Dreams were supposed to be intangible, fleeting things, not places where someone could kill you. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The missing teens, the identical nightmares, the factory. But the real question gnawed at me. How could I stop him? I sat on the couch in the dimly lit room, my thoughts swirling. The faint hum of the heater was the only sound, but it felt as though the walls themselves held their breath. That's when I heard a faint, metallic scraping sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, like metal grinding against metal. My heart jumped into my throat as I stood, every nerve in my body on high alert. The sound grew closer, more distinct, echoing from the shadows at the edge of the room. And then I saw them, four glinting claws, dragging against the wall, emerging from the darkness. My breath hitched. My armor wasn't with me, and for the first time in years, I felt completely exposed. And then he stepped into the faint light. Freddy Krueger. His face was a grotesque canvas of burns, his smile a twisted mockery of humanity. "You're next," he said, his voice dripping with malice. It was as if he could see straight into my soul, drawing out every fear I'd ever buried. My legs felt like lead. My body refused to move. I tried to speak, to demand where Rhodey was, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could do anything, he vanished into thin air, leaving only his sinister laughter behind. I bolted upright, gasping for air. My heart was racing, my clothes damp with sweat. It was just a dream, or was it? I scanned the room. Everything was as I'd left it, but the sense of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that Freddy had been there, in some way that defied logic. The next morning, I resolved to return to the factory. If there was any chance of uncovering the truth about Freddy Krueger and finding Rhodey, it had to be there. I arrived just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson. The factory loomed before me, a hulking, charred skeleton of a building. The air around it felt different, heavier, colder. My suit's sensors picked up faint, erratic energy readings like nothing I'd seen before. It was as if the fabric of reality itself was thinner here. As I stepped closer, the readings spiked. My HUD flickered, warning signals cascading across the screen. Then, without warning, the ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple, and a blinding light erupted in front of me. A portal. It shimmered and twisted, its edges jagged and unstable. I'd seen interdimensional phenomena before, but this felt wrong, malevolent. The air grew colder still, my breath condensing in the eerie glow of the portal. And then he was there. Freddy Krueger, standing just beyond the swirling light, his claws gleaming, his burned face twisted into a grin that promised nothing but pain. "You came back," he said, his voice a mocking drawl. "Good. I was hoping for round two." I barely had time to react before he lunged. His claws raked against my armor, sending sparks flying. The impact sent me staggering back. I fired a repulsor blast, but he moved faster than I thought possible, dodging with an almost supernatural agility. He was relentless, his claws tearing into my suit with a ferocity I hadn't anticipated. Every blow felt personal, as if he wasn't just attacking me but everything I stood for. "What are you?" I shouted, my voice strained as I tried to block his attacks. "Your worst nightmare," he snarled, slashing again. His claws dug deep into my shoulder plate, sending a jolt of pain through me. It was as if the suit's protection meant nothing to him. And then I realized this wasn't just a physical fight. Freddy was playing by his own rules, warping reality around him. The fight dragged on, every second feeling like an eternity. I was fast, but he was faster. He toyed with me, his laughter echoing in the dark, oppressive air. Finally, with a devastating blow, he sent me crashing to the ground. My HUD flickered, warning of critical damage. Freddy loomed over me, his claws poised for the final strike. "Welcome to my world, Tony," he said, his grin widening. And then I woke up. My chest heaved as I gasped for air. I was back in the rented house, sprawled on the couch. But the pain was still there, a dull ache in my shoulder, as if the wounds from the dream were real. I looked down at my armor, which was resting on the floor nearby. The scratches were there, deep, unmistakable gouges, as if someone had torn into it. I barely had time to process this when the doorbell rang. My heart raced as I approached the door, half expecting another nightmare to unfold. I opened it to find Rhodey standing there, a look of concern on his face. Relief washed over me, and I stepped forward to greet him. But as I reached out, he vanished. In his place stood Freddy Krueger, his laughter filling the air. Before I could react, his clawed hand lashed out, striking me square in the chest and sending me sprawling backward. "Welcome back, Stark," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Welcome to my world."